So, what I wanted to start off with is some of the high-level things that we do. So this is part of a talk that I typically give at Laserfish every year, and it's really on what for me is the hardest part, which is defining where are the gaps that we don't understand as we talk about an automated process. It's all well and good to say we want to automate payroll or we want to automate purchasing or something like that. But the real issues become, and as we talk through this, and Sean and I give you some anecdotes of our experience of automating things that have been done here at ThinkDox, it becomes really difficult because it's never clear to anybody in the process or anybody trying to build an automated process how anything actually gets done. We know what we do, we know what the end result is, but there's usually some voodoo magic at some point in the process that we just typically don't know. And so this quick part of the talk, and I'll try and keep it down to 20 minutes maximum, we're going to go through three parts. This will give you a bit of, and this will be grounded more in Laserfish, what's shaping ECM and information management in general. So how do we get here where we don't actually understand processes? How do we ensure that you actually, when you build an automated process, you're making it easier, not harder, for people to get stuff done? And then some of the non-technical tips and tricks that we sort of go through ourselves when Sean and I are building, or when whether we're doing it for a client or we're doing it internally, to try and make sure that we are sort of building something that's going to be better than today. And I'm never looking for perfect myself. I'm looking for better than today, and then you can sort of iterate and build on each thing. Sean and I go through this process, and we always say, is that a version 1.0 feature, or is that a version 2? And that's we find that helpful to make sure that we're not over baking it from the beginning when we may not really understand a process. So, I think one thing that that sort of has happened under a lot of people's noses, and they don't really understand, is how we deal at the corporate, or in this case the municipal, how we deal with information. Before you put it into a network drive that's inside the corporate wall, there's no way to get to it. It's nice and controlled. It gets turned into reports, so you have that fire control. You have the fuel, which is the standardized reports, and then you have the things that people make to share with each other. Nowadays, it's more of a firework where you have all these things that come from the corporate wall, and then you have all these things that come from people, and you get a bunch of pretty pictures that may or may not be of any value. The one difference is now that we've compacted all those things into a mortar, we're now sitting on a bomb, and that's one of the big issues that for a lot of municipalities is becoming pretty clear that they have some risky habits. And historically, this comes because previously, when we were really talking about a piece of paper, it was pretty easy to define a document and a record. You could handle them differently, and they were handled at different times and in different places, and potentially by different people. Nowadays, it's all gotten mixed together. There's no really silos, either because the physical artifacts are there, or because of how we work now. And that's one of the things that's caused these issues, where we don't actually understand what a process is, because people don't just do one thing at a time. We typically multitask. And this has led to this time that we're in now, where processes are not clear, and it's largely because we don't have that rigid organization. People don't do things based on any specific item. It's typically it's done when they need to get it done. And this has led to one of the things, and you're probably well aware, every PDF, every form that you have to fill out has a home, but no one actually ever seems to know where that home is, and sometimes there's two homes for it. And this has led to the junk drawer problem, where our processes have gotten so jumbled because people end up doing multiple jobs at different times that it's unclear how we build the process. And so as we try and move the organization from that very typical issue of we're just going to throw it in the H drive, and then whoever does the next thing to that document knows it's in the H drive, so they're going to grab it from the H drive, do that voodoo that they do, and move it on to the Z drive, where the person who has access to the Z drive does the thing that they do. We want to get away from that a little bit, because the more copies we make of a document, the more chances that we're working on the wrong copy. So again, not to hit this too many times, the way most IT groups look at corporate information here on the left is that it's all in pretty separate boxes, that we don't do things like that. What we know is that a lot of times things get, I was talking to this one organization, part of their process for doing purchase orders, because they had one person who tended to work from home, was that it would get sent to their G drive, and then they'd do it from home, and then they'd send it back to their work email address. So you had, financial documents with account numbers being emailed to a personal G drive, so that somebody could do work and make a copy on their personal computer, because that was easier, and they had they had a better version of Excel than they had on their corporate computer. Now, obviously there's some issues that you should get over, which is, maybe you should just upgrade Excel. But, having said that, that also says that a process is broken if we're having to go outside of corporate walls. So what do we actually need, and what do we actually need to do? So I think one of the areas, and I don't want to spend any time on this, it's really the green question. It's how do people actually get work done, and what pieces do they do that we want to replace, and what things do we just want to make easier? And that's one of the battles that we always get into when we're talking about workflow and automated processes. At what point, what kinds of automation and process changes make life easier, and which just make people uncomfortable? And this is one of those things where we're really talking about how do people, these are the questions that I typically ask when I do a consulting engagement, or when we're, for example, as we're building out our invoicing process to try and automate some of that. The four questions on the four areas are the kind of information you sort of need to know to be able to automate a process. Is how does it get generated? Most of this stuff, so for example, in an invoicing process, you have two parts to it. You have the part which is the actual invoice, and then you have the part which is the who should know and what do they need to know to make a decision on increases, decreases, when to send it, who to send it to. Where does that information have to live? And organized is particularly important in a Laserfiche world. And Sean and I were just having this conversation earlier today. Do we need a physical document in the repository, or is this just a piece of information that should be shared between two people? Is it a record? Is another way to ask this, or is it just a piece of information that somebody needs to know to do their job? And this goes back to that idea of, is it going to be used again? When is it going to be used? So as you're thinking about how you automate a process and how you figure out what the steps are in a process, I find that it's always easier to ask these questions for each step of the process, and to have that definition across each one of those steps, so we can figure out, well, we really don't need a copy of this document, and we don't need 12 versions of this document. No one's ever going to use it again, and it's not something that fits under Tom RIMS or any of our record handling features. So if no one needs a document of it, why don't we just pass the information along to people? And that goes back to this idea that anytime we start doing this, we always have this gorgeous picture of how a process is going to look, where it's always going to go left to right, and there's going to be this really simple, clean idea of, we add a document and it's going to get into these systems, and bada bing, bada boom, we're just going to have it done. And this is how it often ends up looking when we don't consult users. This is usually more likely what it ends up looking like, right? And I think if you guys think about some of your processes, it's probably pretty accurate in some ways, where you have a person-to-person where they use email, and then you have a verbal you have a verbal confirmation, and then you have another place where it has to get inter-office mailed. And then it has to get to that one person who has a user license in the system that nobody else knows how to use. And then it gets printed out because we need another copy that's going to go to somebody else, who's then going to have to make a modification in a secondary system that only one person knows how to use. If we go back to this idealized piece, at no point do we have those looping arrows. We'd love to get here, but again, going back to that idea of version 1.0, you're not going to get there in version 1.0 because there's too many people involved, right? People are messy, and efficiency is not something that people actually want. I think if you look at many processes, comfort is as important, if not more, to people. Defining how comfortable somebody is with a process is often more important than the this is the best way to do it. Just as I stop there, Lisa, Sean, Diane, any questions, any comments, any questions for me?
No, I don't think so far. I think we're all following along. So
great. So once we go through this and we start to build out those workflows, and we build out our skeleton version of a workflow or a process diagram, how do we actually, without losing control of the project and having it go off into, well, I'd really like this element to be pink, and I'd like this one to say, can this one say, reference and payroll and, instead of getting into the minutiae, how do we actually figure out if the process is going to work for somebody and still show them enough that we can make them confident that it's going to make their lives easier? I'm just going to skip over this one. This is more of one of my metaphysical ideas, and it's really around the idea that we have to recognize that you're going to have to make changes as you go. As the process gets automated, there's going to be areas where people are going to go, well, do I really have to do this? And in your frustration, your first comment's going to be, we left it in because that's the way you told me you wanted it. But then it becomes, how do we continue to make changes? How do we do better than today? So when we start talking about how do we actually bring user experience and how people actually work into a BPM, one of the things that I really like to do is take that kind of process by process and bring it back to what a user actually does. So, for example, we were talking with the school board, and it was the HR department. The HR manager had their major issue was that the thing that was making them frustrated with their job went across 3 or 4 different processes. What we found out that it's essentially the same issue. It's that upload of documents and then having to put metadata on them. That was the issue, but it was across 3 or 4 processes, and it was one of the reasons that they had to make changes, was because they felt that the system itself didn't work, because the system hadn't built to put in the templates that they needed and to automate any of that data capture. So I think one of the things that's important as we look at a single process that we want to automate, to have an eye towards the other things that a person does in the context of their job, so that we can look at, is taking this step away really going to save them time, or would it be better to have something which automates all of the upload and then have them do a simpler task in system? Sometimes while it may seem like we are not automating everything that we could and should to gain maximum efficiency, sometimes the efficiency is gained by having somebody do repeatable tasks rather than have a bunch of automated one-offs. And then, and this won't necessarily be as big an issue for you, but it is something to consider as you start moving forward and you start to move to multiple processes that you're mapping. There may be places where sometimes, so for example, I'll give you for example on this. When we started thinking about invoicing and our support documentation and all these other parts, each one of those different processes and workflows seemed that there was a different table. There's a different X, Y, or Z. When we took that moment to step back, what we figured out was we really just needed one place to hold that data and have Laserfiche workflow and Laserfiche forms call from one external table. It was actually simpler than trying to bake all of that into Laserfiche. So, as you start to get into this mindset that you're building these workflows, sometimes we want to take a step back and look at it and say, is there ways to make this overall easier, rather than just focusing on that one process that we want to build. And this may or may not be something that's a problem for you. One of the things that I often encounter when I'm doing this kind of training is the idea that we build the process first and then we take it to users. Sometimes when we're thinking about the process, one of the things that's important is to try and figure out where the pain points are. Every time we automate, every time we have to build something, it has a time cost involved. And we want to make sure that the time costs that we're spending are good expenditures. So, for example, this is from a consulting engagement I did with a hospital in the U.S. And while their initial thought was this was a big, huge billing problem, what they found is that people were actually quite happy with the billing. It was these little parts around contract rationalization and minor issues with procurement that were taking up all their time. They'd rather have to go through a big complicated process for the big billing and have their little issues dealt with, which frankly were a lot easier from a resourcing perspective, than to spend the time and money to fix the big issue and leave all those little issues. Those little issues were what was killing their productivity and efficiency, not the big picture ones. And again, I don't know that this is going to be as much of a problem for SWOCs. When I talk to large organizations, this becomes a big deal that we want to make sure that we're talking across departments and with everybody. Often this is still an issue with, irrelevant of municipality size. Sometimes it's easier in smaller municipalities to have that in the hallway conversation about what you're trying to do, just to keep people that may be involved or may be affected involved, or at least aware. And the key points here are really consider what you need to keep as a record. Again, it goes back to this idea of how much do we want to keep and how much should we, let go off into the ether. So that's pretty much it for this high-level piece of it around more of the mental aspects. Right now I'm going to turn